can't even begin to tell you how honored I am to be on this panel. Thank you, Congressman Frey. Thanks to all of the people who had anything to do with the planning here. Thank you to all of you for coming out here. This is really quite spectacular. Let me ask you, how many of you want to be lawyers? All right. How many of you, you don't know, how many of you want to be school teachers?
I might be a school teacher.
Go into the military?
I was in it.
Maybe be professional athletes? See, I'm touching them all. Okay. Well, okay, you
How many of you want to marry well? Yeah.
Well, that's great. It should come as no surprise after this wonderful discussion that we've been having all day long that it doesn't really matter what you do. This is the book for you. It's very interesting because I teach first-year constitutional law, and I think many times my students expect that they're going to come into my class and learn the 73 rules of constitutional law and be on their way. But of course, we all understand by now that this is so much more complicated than memorizing it. You can read it and think that you know what it says, but really not know what it says. And why is that? Well, because this document has to be interpreted. And in our system of government, everybody, has a responsibility for trying to understand what this document means. But the Supreme Court of the United States is inevitably, the ultimate arbiter, if you will, of the meaning of the Constitution, with a few exceptions. In order to understand what this means then, you kind of have to understand how things get to the court or how things kind of operate. So picking up on where we left off, I think with a wonderful question about woman's right to choose, it may come as a surprise to you, and maybe it doesn't, that the Bill of Rights, which we've been talking about, the first 10 amendments here, didn't apply to limit the state government with respect to you as an individual. Does that surprise you? What does that mean? Does that mean then that a state could have imposed a particular religion on you? If the Bill of Rights only applied to protect you as an individual from federal government, what was it that was supposed to protect you from your own state government? And does anybody know the answer to that? Oh, 14th Amendment. Yeah, well, that took a little time for us to get that in there, right? Well, the whole idea was that people could trust their states. And one of the questions I often ask my students, and Jonathan, you might really appreciate this, is like, well, what does it mean? Who is a state? Who is the state? Right? Where do these state laws come from? And the voters, have a great say in what types of protections they will receive. We are responsible in many ways for protecting ourselves. So, for example, does a woman have a right to choose? Well, when a state passes a law that says a woman doesn't have a right to choose, and that gets challenged, it works its way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will interpret the Constitution, and it has done so, and it has said that, yes, a woman does have a right to choose, within certain limitations, right? So then the state can't pass another law and take that right away from her as an individual. But the state has lots of other ways that it can regulate the choice that she makes. So the state's never really out, Now, if a case were to go to the court, and the court were to say, well, a woman doesn't have a right to choose, then you see the states, each state could decide for itself whether or not a woman would have a right to choose. States can always give you more protection than the Constitution requires, but they can never give you less. That might be, you think, well, take the death penalty, for example. The court has ruled that the death penalty is not cruel and unusual punishment, but that doesn't mean every state, consistent with our federalism principles, that doesn't mean that every state has to impose the death penalty. Some states choose not to. But if a state wants to do that, and the state, through the people, exercise their voice, then they can have the death penalty as a punishment for certain types of crimes. So it's a very complicated system, but all along the way is very, very important for us as voters really to participate in this constitutional endeavor. I often say to my students, con law is law. And in fact, they made a bumper sticker for me once, and I was really sad when I had to trade in my car because I'd lost it. But it said, con law is law. And I'd go all around Gainesville, and everybody would know that was me. But that's where I think we left off. I'm not sure, but we can pick up from there if you would like with whatever questions you might have, or I don't know if...
I think we have one in the audience, a question that we promised somebody would go first.
So the title of the book, which wasn't quoted, but is called Defending Pornography, Free Speech, Sex, and the Fight for Women's Rights. This was my first book published by a mainstream publisher, that is not an academic publisher. And one of the things I learned was that authors don't have free speech rights when it comes to book titles. So they clearly wanted to be provocative and to sell a lot of books, and it was, a very flamboyant cover in its colors as well. One of my friends who had written a dry academic book on the same topic, which wasn't selling as well, said to me with a little bit of jealousy, she said, "Gee, Nadine, couldn't they work the word orgasm into the title too?" But the way I came to the way I came to write the book is the way I come to all of my advocacy. Unfortunately, I almost always have to be defensive because there are so many attacks on civil liberties that I have to come to the defense of those that are under attack. And when it comes to freedom of speech, it's never popular, sweet messages that are threatened by censorship. It's those that are provocative and controversial and under siege. And pornography, which literally means expression with any sexual connotation at all, we use it now as a derogatory term, right? It tends to have a stigmatizing term, but literally it's any writing or images about sex or with sexual connotation. So it would include anything from many biblical passages that, here I shock you, have a lot to do with sexuality, to feminist writings, to even legal writings about topics such as the right to choose abortion. But under the rubric of pornography, laws were being passed in this country at the federal and state levels that were supported by a broad coalition, number one, of anti-pornography feminists on the left, who argued that it endangers women, it leads to a climate of disrespecting women, which can foment violence and discrimination against women. And then on the right, you had cultural conservatives who just didn't like the fact that it was about sex, not necessarily connected to the, quote, traditional nuclear family. I felt it was really necessary to raise my voice as a feminist who strongly believes and has worked for equality of opportunity and against violence against women, to explain why censoring sexual expression, no matter what you call it, does more harm than good, specifically to women's rights and advocates of women's rights, to reproductive freedom, advocates of reproductive freedom, and also, by the way, to LGBT rights, because no matter what the motive is of the person who is advocating for the law, and I assume very good faith motives on the part of those who really thought that this would be good for women, I showed that every single anti-pornography law was being enforced disproportionately to silence voices that were advocating freedom and equality for women. So that's the short answer. Please read the book. If you don't feel like reading the book, there are pictures in the middle. Not necessarily the kind of centerfolds you would expect in a book about pornography, but seriously, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. I chose images so that no matter what your perspective is, no matter what your beliefs Mozart, you would find some picture there and you say, that shouldn't be censored, but then you would understand how it could be described as pornography. So I hope that's titillating enough that you'll read it. Thank you.
I agree with Professor Turley 100% that the Electoral College should be eliminated, but I'm sure, the 12th Amendment would have to be amended, and maybe you could tell the students the difficulty in amending the Constitution, and give me one good reason why the Electoral College should be kept, because I feel my vote is not as strong as it should be, one person, one vote, with the Electoral College.
Well, it's an excellent question. First of all, in terms of the difficulty, the framers did make it difficult to amend the Constitution. You need a supermajority in terms of the vote to even get it before the states. It's got to go through Congress. The president does not have a veto on that, but it has to get through a very high vote in Congress, and then it's got to pass a very high number of states. And they did that for a very simple reason. They did not want us to engage in sort of impulse buy legislation to clutter up the Constitution. And there's been an array of constitutional amendments proposed in Congress. I'm often called in to consult on them. And I must tell you, 99% of them are foolishness. And I'm primarily called in to tell a member that not all of us can be James Madison, and you're not one of that small minority. These are often very impulsive acts, and Florida knows what that's about, because I handled constitutional questions for the Florida legislature, and Florida has one of the worst state constitutions in the country, largely because it was easy to amend, and so you had everything in the Florida Constitution. You even had a provision on pig slaughtering in the Florida Constitution, and that shows you the extreme other end of that. That is, when you allow a constitution to be so easily amended that it just becomes a form of graffiti for everyone to go in there and do that. Now, turning to the Electoral College, I am a major critic of the Electoral College. I do not know of a single positive remaining role. The Electoral College was designed to help protect particularly small states, to force candidates to go to those states, to give them an enhanced role in the election of presidents. It was also part of a general theme that you see in the early days. You know, we talk about this being a democracy, but it's not. Okay, it's not a pure democracy. It's not like ancient Greek states, and there's a good reason for that. I mean, people like James Madison saw pure democracies as inherently unstable, and they were. A pure democracy is you having direct votes on everything. And instead, we went with a representative democracy. And part of that was because the framers believed that the people needed to have educated representatives who would carry out these decisions for them. And maybe at that time, quite frankly, when there's a lot of uneducated Americans, we were a new nation, that served its purpose. And perhaps even then, the protection of small states served its purpose. The Electoral College now, in my view, is 100% negative consequences. What it does is it reinforces the two parties, because the Republican Party owns Utah, they own Wyoming, and then Democratic Party owns other states. And it reinforces those party structures. It deprives minorities, whether you are a Democrat in parts of Massachusetts, Republican parts of Massachusetts, or a Democrat in parts of Utah, it basically negates your vote. Now, what would happen if we got rid of the Electoral College? We'd actually do what the Electoral College was designed to do. That is, right now, candidates don't go to many states where they're not going to get the electoral votes in the general election. So what would happen if we eliminated the Electoral College? What would Obama do, for example, knowing that there are, a couple 100,000 votes in Salt Lake City that he can get by going to Salt Lake City and making a pitch? He'll go there. And Mitt Romney is going to go to Boston, because at that point they're going to try to get as many votes as possible. And then suddenly you have candidates who are campaigning in all of the states. And final point, This election, more than anything else, shows how dysfunctional this is. And Florida, again, is the reason. This state should not be as important as it is. Not because it's not important. It's a big state. It has a right to be heard. But it is not just Florida, it's the Latino vote. Take a look at all of the campaigns right now with Obama and Romney basically working for the Latino vote. Why? Because they need Florida, and they need Colorado, and they need Nevada. So what happens? Suddenly, our position on Cuba becomes the main issue in a country that has huge unemployment, an educational system that is truly one of the worst in the world. We've got major economic issues to tackle, and we're talking about Cuba. And it's because the Electoral College has grotesquely changed the entire political campaign, because the votes that matter right now are Latino votes in 5 swing states. And I don't think the framers would ever have wanted that. It is, in my view, a ridiculous system.
Just a quick couple comments on the Florida Constitution. It really is a Christmas tree. And what happens is, if there's a tough issue in the legislature that no one wants to touch, you put it on the constitutional amendment, you say you've done your thing, but you've actually walked away from your responsibilities, as far as I can see. Plus, it is a wonderful cottage industry. The search for new parts of the Florida Constitution at least have provided jobs. And that's about it. It really hasn't worked at all, and I think anything we can do to slow that down or do away with it, I just think would be most important.
An example that might kind of drive this home in terms of the framers making it really hard for us to amend the Constitution, there was a man who burned the United States flag on the courthouse steps in Texas, and one would think from the reaction that he was probably the only person in the United States who thought it would be a good idea to burn the United States flag, right? And it was against the law. So he was suffering, vulnerable to criminal prosecution and so forth, but he challenged the law, saying, well, this is my free speech right. And that went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, you know what, you're right. It is your free speech right to burn the flag. Well, that upset so many people. Like I said, it must have been that this person was the only one who thought this was a cool thing to do. Congress said, well, we'll pass a federal law, right, that makes it a federal crime to burn the flag. And the Supreme Court, right, steps in and says, well, no, we told you that the First Amendment means that you can burn the flag without fear of criminal prosecution, and we meant it, right? And again, and President Reagan, remember, there was this call for amending the Constitution, because that's really the only way that you can overrule the court when the court interprets the Constitution, is to amend it. That's the check on the court, one of the checks on the court. And there's all this public cry, and President Reagan at the time was saying, we got to amend the Constitution. And now I bet maybe you didn't even know that was happening. It's just sort of died down. It's gone away. It's not an issue anymore.
7 years to do it, right?
Yeah.
Actually, I think a lot of the issues can be solved at the state level. I mean, I'm a teacher. I see the 3% pension coming down, things like that, and property taxes. All those things are determined at the state level. And I've even lived out in smaller cities where city council votes have been determined by less than 20 votes of the entire population. And so I was just curious what your guys' thoughts were on, maybe to tell the students, why do you think state politics are valuable, and what effects can they have? Sometimes they forget. Some of our senators, like Marco Rubio, they started in the state legislature, and they worked their way up through that. So what values do you think the state governments have and can serve?
Well, I'm a Floridian too, so I'm suffering, and I teach at a state university, so I'm suffering a lot of the things that you're talking about. To the extent, when it comes to individual rights, okay, to the extent that one doesn't have a fundamental right that's protected under the Constitution, there's a whole lot of leeway for the states. Okay, we'll leave federal law aside for now. There's a whole lot of leeway for states to make laws. Okay, so states have a tremendous amount of regulatory power, so to speak. They can't interfere with federal power. That's what we saw happening in Arizona with the immigration law and so forth. But education, for example, the court did decide a case where the question was, is education one of those fundamental rights, like privacy, like free speech, like freedom of religion, that attaches to the individual, so the individual has sort of a constitutional shield that will protect the individual from too much state regulation or federal regulation? And the court said, no, it's not one of those kinds of rights. Education is an area of traditional state concern. And so states have a lot of say over what the education laws are going to be. And then we go back to, well, who is the state? Well, the voters are the state in many ways, right? And that's where you get into the political process, and that goes back to what Jonathan was saying about how people are feeling so disenfranchised. I mean, yeah, we can vote and so forth, but we're feeling like government has become so far removed from what's relevant to us, and we need to take it back, because we can control a lot of these educational policies.
Yeah, and go ahead, please.
That's just a couple thoughts, and I'm still bouncing back on your talk about the Electoral College and that, and the underlying problems that I think we have in this country. You know, I guess we're at a point now where when we have discussions, I think the people in Congress and that really forget who they took an oath to. I didn't take it to the Republican Party. My friends didn't take it to the Democratic Party. We took it to the Constitution to preserve, defend, and protect the Constitution as our way to go, and we've forgotten that, and it's become personal. And just make wonderful arguments. It's hard to even say anything. I'll get booed probably, but you know, it's just not looking at the Electoral College. If we're going to change the Electoral College, do we go to a unicameral legislative body? I mean, the Senate doesn't make sense if we have, I think, the way that you're headed. I think there's some really basic problems, and what really worries me is that we have young people in our state, for instance, 42% of the people in Florida can't name the 3 branches of government. 40% can't explain separation of powers. 73% of our 4th graders in a multiple choice test can't pick the Constitution out as our legal document. You know, and here we are, we're wrestling with these problems and so forth, and it's like trying to play football with replacement guys. You know, it really doesn't work, and when we talk about this and thing, just my own thought is that let's still remember there are some basic stuff that we've got to do, and Florida will change it. We're going to have 1 million kids through the program in 5 years. We're not going to be 46th in the country. We're going to be in the top 5 or 10% in Florida. We at least will know what the rules are, so when we go out and talk about these things, we understand the rules, and then we can make an intelligent choice. But now you're just sort of throwing dice against the damn wall and hope they come up 7. So anyway, it's really something that bothers me. I don't know quite how it fits in the answer, but
no, I agree entirely. I have to tell you, I've long believed that the greatest national security threat facing this country, bar none, is our educational system. I don't know what people think is going to happen, but all of our scores, our investment, they're all going down. And what's worse yet is our competitors are all spending more. I have a picture I show my kids. I just gave a speech in Beijing, and my host took me to a local high school. And this was like everything in China is huge. And I took a picture with my iPhone of what looked like 1,000 Chinese kids working on computers. And I showed it to my kids and said, these are going to be your future bosses, okay? Unless you get your act together. These people are serious. And unless you want to work for these folks, then we've got to take things seriously. And what's bothersome to me is nobody in Congress seems to be that upset with what is inevitably going to happen. We are not training the workforce we need to compete against China, Japan, all these other countries. Even our European allies are doubling up on education, and we are continuing to fall. We're continuing to cut education, reduce these investments. So what's going to happen? We're going to become a second world power economically. We're going to be working for foreign companies. And to me, that is the greatest threat. And so what can you do? Tip O'Neill once said, all politics is local, and it is. You know, if you have to pick a cause, you've got your whole life in front of you, and you've got to pick a cause that defines you. Why not make it liberty? Make it saving this democracy. Work locally. Fight on issues like education. Shame my generation. Get up and say, you are destroying our future. And you can make a difference, because my generation is really composed of a lot of burnout cases. And faced with people like you who care about their country and say, we want you to put support in for public education, particularly in the high school, the secondary education. Make them listen. And you'd be surprised at how successful you can be.
I was wondering, what can we do to help schools get more money to educate the kids more, since you're saying that we are the future, and if we educate each other more, then I believe that we all can become successful and know more about what we're doing.
Well, one is, first of all, Florida has a very low salary for teachers and low benefits for teachers. It's important to reinforce teachers. They make a huge, huge sacrifice for teaching our kids, particularly in the public schools. But also, there's just a lack of investment in schools. And quite frankly, this is going to be less popular. I'm a big critic of voucher systems. I send my kids to public schools, not because I have to. We are financially able to send our children to any of the private schools. We made a commitment, as did my parents, by the way, to go to public schools. They sent me to public school in Chicago, even though they were well off. And the reason is that we believe strongly that public schools are this common experience for citizens. It should be this it's a very pluralistic environment. Many of you really were exposed to different views, different races, different lifestyles in high school. That's called pluralism. That's the society you're going to be entering as adults. And frankly, I've opposed voucher systems because they are undermining our public schools, and they're denying us that common experience. My kids go to public school, and I'm very proud of it. And they are learning to work and live and communicate with their future neighbors. And I think that's where you need to really focus, not just on vouchers, but to organize, go to legislatures, write to your state representatives, ask them why they're not making more of an investment. Show them these scores. Go on the internet, take a look at the scores. I just put on my blog. A week ago, 87% of 8th graders in Chicago were found to be less than proficient in English reading. Bring those type of scores to your state legislature. The scores are not that much different from Florida. And to say, what are you doing about this? Don't just keep on hammering teachers. It's not the teachers. It's you're not making an investment. We're really good on making investments in defense spending. Nobody in Congress questions that. You can always get whatever you want in defense spending. But for some reason, for educational stuff, which has more to do with the economic security of this country, you cannot get a member to put forward a serious educational bill that actually helps fund programs.
We talked a lot today about, we talked about women's rights issues, we talked about funding for schools, we talked a lot about voting and how this generation is going to be making the changes in the next couple years, and how some of the seniors are going to have a chance this time around if they turned 18 in time. We have 3 constitutional amendments to the Florida Constitution that are on the ballot right now that deal with all of those issues. I wonder if you could just talk to them a little bit about the importance of not just knowing about your candidates, but in knowing about the amendments that are going to change your state's constitution, and the importance of researching those. We have an 8-page ballot in Orange County. Most people aren't going to even read it, let alone vote for it. So I was just asking.
Nor understand it.
Nor understand it, that's correct.
Sharon, you want to do that?
Well, it's like I was saying before, the power that you have as a voter, and this isn't something, maybe, it's something that you have to be taught. It goes back to our education system, right? And even my constitutional law students are, I think, somewhat surprised at how important their single vote is in the overall process. They'll say, well, how can the president get away with this? And I'll say, well, because the voters let the president get away with this. Well, how can this happen? Well, how can it be that there's so much inequality in education? Like, and going back to the former question, it's like, okay, you drive through different neighborhoods, for example, and you can see, right? You can see the inequality. It's like all around you, and you're thinking, well, how does this happen? How can we, be in such be a United States, if you will, be the state of Florida, if you will, and tolerate so much inequality in education? Now, part of that is because one of the things you were saying, Jonathan, is that the voucher system and allowing, or just students being able to go to private schools. It might surprise you, but private schools, to a large extent, are not held to constitutional standards. They don't have to. In other words, in terms of the Bill of Rights, it's only the government that can violate your individual rights. It's not private people that can violate your individual rights. And so there are lots of reasons that parents would send their kids to private schools. That's why a parochial school, for example, is constitutional and it's private, right? But we wouldn't have religion, for example, in a public school. But there's absolutely no way things will change if people don't get informed and go out and vote and make informed choices.
In Florida, in the primary elections, both times we had 19.5% of the people vote. Okay, just stop a minute. Only half are registered, so you don't have 19% of the population. You have 10% of the population. To win, then, you need 5.1% of the vote. And that's what we did in Florida. 5.1% of the total people voted for our U.S. Senator nomination and, of course, for the Congress and for the U.S. Senate. And that Senate race in Florida could be the race that says whether it goes Republican or Democrat in the country. 5.1% of the people effectively voted.
Just go away.
Let's give a hand for the congressman.
Yes, really.
I've been on injured reserve, but I'm going to be ready for the Kentucky game.
The question is directed towards Professor Turley. You said that the two-party system and the hyper-partisanship that we have in our government is making it impossible for things to progress. How do you propose that we, as a new generation of voters, can put an end to this?
It's an excellent question. Quite frankly, we have to break the monopoly of the Democratic and Republican parties. They are killing this country because of the control they have over our political system. I'm not talking about any particular policy, but what's happening is that you have two parties who are primarily designed to replicate themselves, to keep the leadership in power, and they will say and do anything to do that. And the problem is that they have no competition. So I've been writing in my column for a number of years that we need to have Americans get upset enough to call for fundamental changes. First, you have to guarantee that there are not ballot impediments to third-party candidates. Many states make it difficult for third-party candidates, independents, to get on the ballot. Second, probably the most important thing, get the Minnesota rule. It'll break the control of incumbents. Pass a law that says that the two top vote getters in the primary, regardless of their party, even if they're from the same party, will run in the general. If you do that, you will see incumbents disappear in Congress. They will evaporate because people don't necessarily want these people to go back to Congress, but they don't necessarily want to vote for the other party. 3, get rid of the Electoral College. And 4, one of the things that we've been talking about is the need to get better financing, more opportunities for campaigns. I don't know why we don't require a certain number of debates for every office. I find it bizarre that candidates can say, I'll do 2 debates, I'll do 3 debates. I don't know why why the public doesn't say, you know what, you're going to do 5 debates. You're going to debate. I actually thought people were making fun of the Republican primary. I thought the Republican primary was a heck of a lot better than the Democratic primary, which didn't exist. Right? I mean, everyone was complaining, oh my God, another debate of the Republicans. It's like, really? I thought it was fantastic that the Republicans had so many debates where we got to see these candidates over and over again, under scrutiny. Frankly, that's what was missing the Democratic Party. It was, you got a choice of one on that ballot effectively. So you can do those types of things, and it would be wonderful. This is a good subject for high school debates. It's a good subject for your civics classes. How can you reform the political system? How can you do it in Florida? You can really make a difference in this. Some of these things are possible, including the Minnesota system. You could push that.
It's very interesting, too, if I just might add, it's like, think about the Tea Party, for example, and think about how hard it is, in light of what Jonathan has said, to think of the Tea Party as a separate party, because it didn't take very long for it just to be seen as on one end of the spectrum of the Republican Party. It's like it's very difficult, even with a party name, Tea Party, it's very difficult to divorce yourself from the Republican or the Democratic continuum.
And look how people buy into this red state, blue state stuff. It's a scam. I mean, I got to tell you, now look, I'm an independent, but it's a scam. The whole red state, blue state thing, they're doing that to you. They're getting you to hate the other side so that you will vote no matter who is the Republican or Democrat in your district. And we've become a nation of chumps. We just eat that stuff up. And I've been very critical of civil libertarians who are supporting Barack Obama without addressing his rollback on civil liberties. And it's a good example that, there's very little criticism of Obama despite some serious blows to civil liberties. And it goes to this whole red state, blue state thing again, where we've just become a nation of chumps.
Responses?